This is a story about three strangers who had been forced together by a tragic situation. Their names are Clara, a woman in her 30s who worked at a local clinic, George, a high school math teacher, and Anna, a 12-year-old girl whose parents had gone missing. This tale is not for the faint of heart, but if you will, please hear their story. They just so happened to all be together when it happened. The three met during a terrible car crash that was caused by an out-of-control teenager driving while intoxicated. All three were fortunate enough to survive this ordeal, but they soon discovered that they would share a fate that none of them could have ever imagined. At first, the three became friends and shared the trauma that they had all endured. But as time passed, things began to change for each of them. As one would imagine, the shock of such a traumatic event could cause some changes to take place with the mind. One of these changes that occurred in Clara was that she fell into a deep depression and never wanted to leave her house. She often refused to see anyone or talk to people. Her mind would constantly replay the events from that terrible night over and over again. This had a negative effect on her psyche, and she began to feel as though her life was meaningless. The same was true for George and Anna. Anna was unable to process the death of her parents, and it affected her greatly. She struggled to sleep at night, and would often end up crying in her bed. She couldn't understand why her parents had left her, and it really hit her hard. George was also very distraught over the loss of his wife, whom he loved dearly. He struggled with the fact that he would never see her again. She was always the one who knew how to get him out of his funk, but now there was no one around who could help him do that anymore. So they all ended up going through similar issues, but their personalities were different, and it caused each of them to go down a completely different road. George continued to struggle with his grief, and fell into a deep depression. He drank too much and barely cared about anything anymore. He eventually became an alcoholic, and was no longer able to teach school. Anna became distant from him and rarely spoke to him anymore. They both lost hope, and life felt empty for each of them. Clara, on the other hand, began to change for the better. She became more friendly towards people, and her mind was not consumed with sadness and regret anymore. She actually found that she enjoyed helping people who needed assistance. It made her feel good and helped her forget about what had happened to her. George, on the other hand, fell back into his old ways, and Anna soon distanced herself from him as well. They had nothing in common anymore, and they realized they would just end up arguing, and that's exactly what they did. This became a vicious cycle that carried on for a while, but finally Clara, Anna, and George decided to move away from this town. A few years later, Clara, George, and Anna all happened to run into each other again at a park. They had all grown up and gotten older, but they still had the same look in their eyes. They were all in desperate need of something, but they didn't know what. They all seemed to have lost the will to live. None of them were happy with where they were in life, and they had all given up. "How are you guys doing?" asked Anna. "I haven't seen any of you since we moved." "We're fine," replied George. "And I'm glad to see that," said Clara. "What's wrong with us? Why do we feel like this?" asked George. "Well, I think that after losing someone close to you, you just kind of lose your sense of purpose. You don't want to live anymore because you feel as though you'll never find happiness again. So you give up." "That sounds horrible. I couldn't possibly let myself fall into such a dark hole." "Don't worry, George. Things can only get better from here. We just need to keep moving forward. Yeah, I guess you're right, replied George. Anna looked at the ground as she sat on a bench. Hey Anna, are you alright? Why do we feel this way? She asked. I don't know. Sometimes I wish I could go back to before that day and change everything that happened. It was so painful and awful. I just want to move on and start fresh. I can't believe we've been so miserable for this long. How many years has it been? It's been about 7 or 8 months now. Wow, I'm surprised I haven't noticed. I feel so empty inside. I wonder if I should go see my doctor and tell him I need medication. Maybe that will make me feel better. Are you serious? You think that's gonna solve anything? I dunno. I just feel like I've been doing this by myself for too long. I need some guidance. Do you think that's even possible? Do you really think you're missing out on something that is going to get you out of this rut? I don't know. That's why I think I should try. Anything is worth a shot, right? Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know what you're really hoping to achieve here. You're just running around in circles and getting nowhere. You need to decide what it is you want to do. And then you need to focus on that and leave everything else behind. Clara, George, and Anna all stared at each other blankly. They didn't know what to say. They were all lost. The truth of the matter was that they had been lost for quite some time. None of them were satisfied with their lives. They had no idea what it was that they wanted to do with themselves, and that was the main reason why none of them felt fulfilled. They all stood up and walked away from each other. They knew they would probably never see each other again. Their paths had already diverged. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The next morning, Anna woke up feeling refreshed and renewed. She felt as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, and she could finally breathe again. She got out of bed and went downstairs. Her parents were sitting at the table drinking coffee and reading newspapers. She walked over and poured herself a cup of coffee. "Good morning, Mom," said Anna as she took a sip of her coffee. But, of course, there was no reply. Her parents were gone and nothing could change that. She thought about how much she missed her mother and father. It was hard to imagine being without them. It wasn't fair that she had to be alone. But, at the end of the day, she knew that they were better off. They weren't suffering anymore. And if they hadn't left, maybe they wouldn't be as happy. Anna finished her coffee and put her mug in the dishwasher. As she turned to walk away, she stopped suddenly. There was a piece of paper lying on the floor. She bent down and picked it up. It was a note from her mom. "Dear Anna, I know this isn't easy for you, but I promise I'm in a better place. I know that you miss me and I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. I just needed to get away for a while. You and your brother are in our thoughts every single day, and I hope you know that we love you both more than anything in this world. We will always be watching over you from above. Love, Mom." Anna crumpled the paper up and threw it across the room. She looked at the clock on the wall and realized that it was almost noon. She had completely forgotten about work. Her cell phone started vibrating on the kitchen counter. She walked over and grabbed it. It was a call from the police department saying that they needed her to come in and help. Anna sighed as she hung up the phone. She had hoped that maybe today would be different. that maybe her life would somehow take a turn for the better. But, unfortunately, things didn't seem to have changed. She still had no idea what she wanted to do. She still felt lost. This was when she decided that she needed to stop running and look within. She needed to figure out who she really was and what she wanted her future to hold. She wiped a tear from her face and headed upstairs. She dressed quickly, brushed her teeth, and left the house. This time she was determined not to forget where she lived. She took a deep breath and marched straight into her bedroom. As soon as she entered, she noticed that everything was exactly as she had left it. Her clothes were still neatly folded on the dresser. Her books were arranged on the nightstand. Even the sheets on her bed were perfectly made. She sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to clear her mind. All she wanted was for someone to guide her. Someone who could show her the way. She closed her eyes and listened intently. She heard nothing. No voices. No footsteps. Just silence. She opened her eyes and looked around. Everything was exactly the same as it had always been. She was still alone. She didn't know what to make of it. She stood up and walked towards the closet. She reached inside and pulled out a white t-shirt and pair of blue jeans. She tossed them onto the bed and smiled to herself. She liked the color combination. It was fresh and clean looking. She picked up her phone and texted her boyfriend. "Hey babe. Wanna go out tonight?" "Oh, okay. I'll be waiting for you." She walked back over to the bed and began pulling out dresses. She grabbed a few black ones, and then a couple of red ones. She didn't want to wear any of these colors. They reminded her too much of her past. She wanted to try something new. Something exciting. She picked up a purple dress and held it in front of her body. She thought about how nice the color looked against her skin tone. She shook her head. "What am I thinking? I can't wear that. It's too bold. Too bright." She put the dress back down and continued digging through her closet. She found a few pieces of clothing that caught her eye. A simple gray top with jeans. A long flowing skirt. She ran her finger along the fabric and thought about how soft it felt. She placed the clothes down on the bed and contemplated their potential. She was beginning to feel excited. She grabbed a pair of sandals and slipped her feet into them. She grabbed her purse and headed downstairs. She checked the time and decided that she'd grab dinner on her way. She called Anna's number and got her voicemail. She hit the button to listen to it again. "Hey baby, it's me," she said. "Sorry I haven't answered the phone. I've been super busy lately. I'll give you a call tonight. Love you." She hung up the phone and smiled. She could tell that he missed her already. She texted him. "I'm heading out for a while. Call you later, babe." She headed outside and jumped into her car. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She smiled to herself as she turned the ignition and drove off. She kept smiling until she pulled up to the police station. The detective was waiting for her in the parking lot. He hopped out of his squad car and approached her. "Hello, Miss Anderson," he said. "How are you doing?" He handed her a note. She took it from him and read it. "You're going to need this," he said. "It's an address. If you don't find anything there, we may have to take another look at your file." She nodded. She knew that he was right. She took the paper and tucked it securely into her pocket. She gave him a weak smile and got back into her car. She headed towards the exit. Her heart was pounding. She felt as if she was driving in circles. "What is it?" the detective asked. "Nothing," she replied. "Just keep looking. I'm sure I'll find something soon." She sighed. She couldn't believe that she was actually considering it. She felt like she was losing her mind. She started to feel dizzy. The world around her seemed to spin wildly. She grabbed the steering wheel and tried to steady herself. She reached behind her seat and pulled out her bottle of water. She unscrewed the cap and took a big gulp. "This isn't real," she whispered. "None of this has really happened. None of it." She took another drink and cringed when the liquid spilled down her chin. She wiped it away with her hand and continued driving. A voice spoke up in her ear. "If you don't want to do this, you don't have to." She jerked her head towards the front seat. She saw a man standing next to her. His face was hidden in the shadows. She gasped and quickly sat up. She brought the bottle of water to her lips and took a sip. "Who are you?" she demanded. "I'm here to help you, Miss Anderson," he said. "But I need you to trust me first." "Do you think you can do that?" "Why should I trust you?" "Because," he answered. "If you don't want to do this, you can stop. There's no harm done." She stared at him for a moment. She looked down at the paper in her hands. She wondered who could have written it. Who would have sent it to her? She started to get scared. She looked back up at the man. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "Should I follow the instructions or not? I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to be free." She gulped down the last bit of water and threw the empty bottle out the window. She had made up her mind. She was going to do it. She picked up her purse and slid her arm inside. She locked her door and walked towards the man. He stepped aside so that she could pass. She stopped by the passenger side of the car and looked through the open window. She saw a woman sleeping in the back seat. She was curled up against the window and snoring loudly. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. She was wearing a baggy t-shirt and black sweatpants. Her hair was a mess and matted across her face. She was too tired to care about how she looked. It was obvious that she didn't have much money. She probably lived on the streets. She leaned in and looked at the woman. Her eyes were bloodshot. She was breathing heavily, as if she had been running for a long time. She was covered in a thin layer of dirt. She appeared to be in her late 30s. She wasn't wearing shoes, but she wore a pair of black socks that came up to her knees. "Who is she?" Clara asked the man. "She's just some homeless woman," he replied. "Nothing to worry about." "She looks awful," she said. "I don't know if I can do this." The man put his hand on her shoulder. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Do you have any other choice?" he asked. "No," she answered. "I guess not." "Clara?" Anna questioned. Her words startled the woman in the back seat. She woke up and looked towards the front seat. She screamed and looked over the seats. "Sure," the man said. "Don't wake her. We don't want her to know where we're going." "Where are we going?" she demanded. "To the address that was in your file," he answered. We have to hurry. We don't have much time. I don't understand what's happening, she said. You've kidnapped me. You say that you're trying to help me, but I don't know what's going on. What is this about? It will all make sense once we get there, he replied. He opened the driver's side door and climbed into the front seat. He closed the door and pulled the seatbelt across himself. He leaned forward and started to drive. Wait, she said. How am I supposed to go anywhere like this? Where are my clothes? He glanced over and smiled. I'll take care of that, he said. Just sit tight and keep quiet. She sat up straight and looked at him. He was starting to frighten her. She looked ahead at the road. The city was beginning to change. Soon they were driving past small farms and fields. They passed several large homes and ranches. It was still daylight outside, but it was getting darker. She could see the sun setting behind a distant hill. She turned to look at the woman in the back seat. She was clutching the blanket around herself tightly. She looked as if she was barely awake. She was staring at the front seat. She didn't seem to notice that Clara was sitting next to her. She looked back at the man. She watched him drive through the countryside. She saw a few other cars on the road. Most of them were heading towards the sunset. A few people waved at them as they drove by. She wondered why nobody was stopping to help her. Nobody seemed concerned that a crazy man had kidnapped her. Why weren't they calling the police? She looked back at the woman again. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The woman was still staring at the front seat. She was looking at Clara, but her gaze was unfocused and confused. She was having trouble focusing. It was like she was only half awake. What's wrong with her? Clara asked. She has severe dementia, he replied. Her condition is deteriorating rapidly. She doesn't remember who she is or what happened to her. She thinks that she's still in the hospital. We got her from an assisted living facility. She had been there for 2 years. Her family didn't come to visit her very often. She was always alone until we found her. Why did you kidnap her? She asked. Is she really that sick? She needs our help, he said. We can't let her die. He put the car in park and shut off the engine. He stepped out and walked around to the passenger's side. He opened the door and helped her out of the back seat. He took her arm and led her to the trunk of the car. He opened the lid and grabbed a large suitcase. Put your things in here, he instructed. I will be right back with something to cover you. He left her in the trunk and walked back to the front seat. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out a bottle of prescription medication. He tossed it to the woman in the back seat. She caught it without any trouble. This is for you, he said. Take one every 6 hours, even if you feel fine. If you vomit it up, don't worry. Just take another pill. Once you start taking it regularly, you should regain your memory. It will be slow, but it should work eventually. He slammed the glove box shut and climbed into the driver's seat. He started the car and backed up slowly. He pulled away from the curb and drove back onto the highway. That's better, he told the woman. Now try not to talk. It's hard for me to concentrate when you're talking. He drove down the highway without saying anything else. They went farther and farther out into the country. There were fewer cars on the road now. Nobody was around them. The buildings were further apart and smaller. She noticed a large house in the distance. It was located on top of a hill. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "We're almost there," he replied. "It's the last place that you need to go before we can help you. It's where you belong. You've been missing for a long time, but you'll soon find out everything that you want to know. It will all come back to you." He reached over and tapped her arm. She stopped talking immediately. He smiled and gave her another pill. After a while, he slowed the car and pulled onto a winding dirt road. He came to a stop and turned off the headlights. "Keep quiet," he said. "You might hear something." She heard a loud noise suddenly. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere in the house. She could hear footsteps walking across the floor. Something heavy was being moved. She looked out the window and saw a tall figure moving in the backyard. It appeared to be a man. It looked like George. She felt relieved. She knew him well. "Who is that?" she asked. "It's my friend," he replied. "I haven't seen him in a while. I think that he's getting ready to meet us." She saw George standing outside on the patio. He was wearing his blue overalls and carrying a toolbox. His hair was dirty and matted. He looked like he hadn't taken a shower in weeks. He looked angry and agitated. "He's going to kill you, isn't he?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "He is going to kill you. He wants to make sure that you stay dead. That's why he brought the hammer. He's going to use it to smash your skull and pulverize your brain." She tried to speak, but her mouth was dry and sticky. She coughed to clear her throat. It hurt terribly. "Please don't do this," she pleaded. "I just want to go home. Please let me go home." He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He seemed to relax. "I'm sorry," he said. "My mind wandered. I got carried away with my thoughts. Don't worry. Everything will be okay. I promise." He took another deep breath and rubbed his hands together. He opened the door and stepped out of the car. He walked to the passenger side and opened the trunk. He pulled her out of the trunk and carried her over to where George stood. He set her down next to him and motioned for her to sit in his lap. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded and looked at George. She could see that he was furious. He was breathing heavily and clenching the handle of a wooden mallet. He was holding it tightly in both hands. "George, please don't do this," she begged. "Let me go home." "No," he replied. "You're not going home. Not until I say so." He opened the toolbox and pulled out several tools. He tossed them to George and then sat down in the grass next to the patio. George picked up the first tool. "Don't worry, baby," he said. "Everything will be fine." He used the hammer to slam the blunt end against the middle of the toolbox. He did this again and again and again. The wood splintered under the hammer's weight. The lid cracked open and fell off completely. The box had lost its structural integrity. George could lift the entire thing easily. He put the lid on the ground and lifted the box. It weighed more than he expected. He grunted as he hoisted it into the air. He shook the box from side to side. It made a loud crunching sound. "It's about time," he muttered. "I thought that you'd never get here." He placed the toolbox down on the patio. It didn't break. He leaned it against the wall, and stepped aside. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. "Why aren't you smiling? Are you scared?" "Of course I'm scared," she replied. "Do you really think that I wouldn't be?" "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But I have to do this. I promised him that I would. I told him that I would show you the way home. He wants to meet you. He's waiting for you inside. I think that he wants to say hello." "Hello?" she asked. "How can he be waiting for me if I'm already dead?" He laughed. "Don't worry," he said. "He doesn't know that. You'll tell him the truth when you see him. I'm sure that he won't believe you. But that's all right. He's an old man. Old men are usually slow. They don't pay attention to details. And they always forget things that don't matter much anyway." He grinned and winked. She couldn't help but smile. "You're funny," she said. "Did you ever think of being a comedian?" "I'm no comedian," he replied. "I'm just a killer. That's why I'm still alive. I don't need to be funny to get ahead in life. I killed people. That's enough." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Now give me a big hug," he instructed. She wrapped her arms around his neck and hugged him tight. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for coming with me today. I knew that you were good for something after all." He rested his chin on top of her head. "Say goodbye to George," he suggested. "Tell him what a nice time you had. Tell him that you're glad that you came with me." She tightened her grip around his neck. "Goodbye, George," she said. "It was fun meeting you. I hope that we run into each other again soon." He smiled. "That's the spirit," he said. "And now you're ready. It's time to go inside." They walked past the pool table and went through the open doorway into the house. "Are you sure that it's all right for us to come in?" she asked. "We might scare him or something." The light was dim inside the living room. The curtains were drawn. A faint glow emanated from the television screen. "Just follow me," he said. "I know where he is." She nodded and kept close behind him. "Is there anything else that I should know before we see him?" she asked. "Nothing important," he replied. "But just remember one thing. Don't let him touch you. If he does, he'll turn you into a zombie like George. Then you can't leave. You'll stay here forever." She stopped walking and turned to him. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. "A zombie." He pointed at the television set. "There's a movie on," he explained. "It's called Night of the Living Dead." "Oh, yeah," she exclaimed. "I've seen that one. It's a classic." She laughed. "You know," she said, "I bet that George has seen it too. Maybe he likes scary movies." He shrugged. "Maybe," he agreed. "I don't know what he gets up to when I'm not around." She continued walking. "So, where is he?" she asked. "Is he still watching the movie?" "In the kitchen," he replied. "George always watches his horror films while eating dinner. He never eats until after the show's over. That's the only way for him to enjoy himself. I've told him that he's crazy. But he doesn't care. He wants to be scared. That's how he passes the time. And this is what you want me to do," she concluded. "I'm supposed to help him finish eating so that he can go watch TV again." Exactly, he replied. They walked through the living room and entered the dining room. A woman in an apron was setting the table. Her name tag identified her as Mrs. Zolowski. "Good evening, George," she greeted him. "Would you like your usual?" "Please," he replied. "The usual?" The cook turned toward them. "Hello," she said. "Did you have a nice day?" He nodded. "It wasn't as good as last night," he admitted. "But I had some fun. I met someone today. She's here at the house right now." Mrs. Zolowski's eyes widened. "Who's here?" she asked. "Do I know her?" "Her name is Clara," he explained. "She works at the hospital." She shook her head. "Oh," she replied. "That's not possible. I haven't seen anyone from the hospital in a long time. The last couple of weeks were very busy for me." George raised an eyebrow. "What's the matter?" he asked. "You look a little bit scared." The cook swallowed hard. "It's just that the doctor who was working for us quit on me," she confessed. "I didn't know if I should fire Mrs. Tootie or Mr. Pete." He chuckled. "You don't need to be afraid," he told her. "This girl won't tell on us. You can trust her." Mrs. Zolowski smiled. "Thank you, George," she said. "You're very kind." The pills, whatever they were, seemed to be helping. Anna and Clara could remember more and more. "Sit down, George," Mrs. Zolowski continued. "I'll bring your food right out." He nodded. "And I want a glass of wine," he added. "Please?" "Of course," she responded. "Anything else?" He shook his head. "No, that's all for tonight." Mrs. Zolowski left the room. Anna and Clara sat next to the man at the table. "Don't be afraid," he said. "She won't hurt you. She's a nice person." Anna smiled. "We don't think that we've ever been inside this house before," she said. "Where do you live?" George glanced over at her. "How much do you remember?" he asked. Clara nodded. "There was an accident," she explained. "I was driving the car, but the other woman died." George nodded. "That's right," he said. "They found you both in the wreckage. The doctors and nurses tried to save your lives, but it wasn't meant to be. I've told you that before. And now you remember. It's good, isn't it?" Clara nodded again. Anna felt relieved. "Do you remember how we met?" she asked him. "You took me for a ride in your car. It was raining, and there was a bridge. We were going to cross it. But you stopped the car, and you let us go back. That's when you invited me to come to dinner here with you." The man laughed. "Yes," he said. "I remember all of that. You remember everything, don't you?" They smiled at him. "It's funny how we ended up here," Anna continued. "You didn't know any of my friends. And I knew none of yours. Yet, here we are, having dinner together. You saved us. I don't know what you would have done if we'd both died. Who would be sitting at the table? What would happen to all of your movies and shows?" He laughed. "I probably wouldn't do much else," he admitted. "Just sit here and watch TV, and drink wine." They shook their heads. "No, you wouldn't," Anna replied. "You'd find something to do. Just like you're doing now." The woman nodded. "Of course, I'll do something else, she agreed. There's nothing in the house. No TV, no phone, no computer, no books. There's just this place. Anna and Clara looked around the room. Is this your home? Anna asked. The man shook his head. Not anymore, he replied. My wife left it for me. But she doesn't live here. She's gone away somewhere. Maybe she will come back one day, but I doubt it. He chuckled. This house is too big for me, he added. I don't have a family. I can't invite anyone over. I've never been able to make friends, and that makes the loneliness even worse. The cook came into the dining area with a tray. She set down the food and poured the wine. Anna smiled as she picked up her fork. It smells so good, she told him. How did you know which foods would be good for us? He shrugged. I don't really remember, he responded. I just sort of guessed, and then I made them all. This is chicken soup, mashed potatoes, and a vegetable casserole. It's supposed to help your memory. Anna took a sip from the wine glass. It tastes wonderful, she agreed. But how do you know we like wine? We didn't say anything about liking it. The man shrugged. That's easy, he answered. I just guess. And it helps to be a bit tipsy. Wine is the best. They ate their dinner. It wasn't the kind of food they would normally order in a restaurant or make themselves at home, but it tasted good. The wine was excellent. After eating for a while, Anna and Clara excused themselves and went into the living room. They sat on the couch and sipped more wine. You know, George, there is something I want to ask you, she said. What is it? The man replied. Why are you here by yourself? He shrugged. I used to have some friends, he explained. But when the accident happened, they stopped coming to see me. They didn't really visit me that often. I don't blame them, of course. But now there's nobody. It's too hard for me to go out to a restaurant or invite people over. So, I stay here and watch television. Sometimes, I take a nap. That's about all I do. Not much to keep you occupied. Clara nodded. And the house is empty, she added. You're alone all day. I know how it is. She paused for a moment. Do you miss your wife? She asked. The woman smiled. Of course, she agreed. She was so pretty. Anna put her hand on the man's shoulder. George, she said. We'd like you to come back with us. We'll show you around the city. We'll go to a restaurant and order a meal together. You can meet our friends. He frowned. Are you sure? He asked. I don't know what you two want from me. I'm not good company anymore. I get scared when I walk down the street. And I'm sure you can't trust me. I think you should leave right away. You don't want any part of me. Anna and Clara stood up. They walked over to the dining table and picked up their jackets. Come on, Clara said to him. You're going with us. We need somebody to talk to. They pulled on their coats and headed out of the house. When they got to the sidewalk, the women opened the doors of the car and got inside. The man climbed into the passenger seat, and Anna drove the car back toward the highway. She turned off at the next exit and drove past the main streets. Then they got onto the interstate and drove north. They didn't say a word for a while. I can't believe this, Anna told the man. How did you guess we were in the market for a driver? How do you always know what we're thinking? He shrugged. I don't, he replied. I just sort of remember things. It comes from being alone so much. He looked out the window. And the fact that I've never been happy, he added. He smiled. When I was married, he continued, I used to talk about how I was unhappy. But I didn't really believe it. I just thought I was better than everyone else. My wife always said I had a great life. She wasn't wrong. We could afford to eat the best food and have the nicest clothes. She had the perfect job. She worked in a fancy law firm. I had my own business. We went to expensive restaurants. But none of it made me happy. I wasn't happy even when I was drunk. Now, I'm completely sober, and I feel so miserable. I want to get back on my feet again. I want to fix something, make things happen. That's all. Anna smiled. We know what you mean, she said. But you need our help. You're right, the man agreed. That's exactly why I came with you. You might not believe me, but I really am sorry for everything that happened. He sighed. I miss her, he confessed. And I want to start living again. If that means you two will take care of me for the rest of my life, then I'm okay with that. They drove through the city for another hour or so. Then they stopped at a restaurant off the highway. The place was crowded and noisy. There was a line outside. Anna led him inside. He didn't look around, though. His eyes stayed focused on his surroundings. He walked behind the woman in the white dress and followed her across the lobby. They took a seat at an empty table in the corner of the room. Clara ordered some food, and Anna explained how the restaurant worked. The man listened closely. When it was time to pay, they left the bill on the table and continued on their way. You never told us about your wife, Anna told him. What was her name? He shook his head. You don't need to know that, he replied. She was just a woman who passed through my life. Anna nodded. She smiled at the man. Well, she said. Here we are. They got back into the car, and Anna drove down the road. They stopped at the first exit they came to and pulled over at a small diner. There were no cars parked along the curb. The place was dark inside. Anna drove through the parking lot, and they got out of the car. She led them to a table in the far corner of the room, where it was quiet and dimly lit. They ordered coffee and breakfast. George watched everything around him. He kept glancing at Clara, wondering why they had come with him. He wondered what they wanted from him. He wished they would talk. Anna gave him the cold shoulder. She ignored him completely. Clara did the same. George didn't realize what they were doing until Anna took a piece of toast from her plate and started talking with Clara. She explained to him that they weren't angry at all. They only wanted to make sure he felt comfortable. Clara and Anna were only trying to protect him. George looked up at Clara and then at Anna. His face reddened. He couldn't believe that Anna had ordered this food for him without telling him about it. I can order whatever I want, he protested. You don't need to tell me about anything. You should trust me. Why do you always have to do that? Can't you just let me make my own choices? His eyes were wet. He kept wiping away the tears. Anna looked at Clara. The two women exchanged glances. They knew each other well enough to know how this conversation would end. Clara bit her lip. She wanted to help the man, but she wasn't sure how. It was too difficult to talk to him like that. Anna picked up her coffee cup. "Okay," she said. "Here's what we'll do. We're not going to talk about this anymore." She held her hands out in front of her. "It's your life, and you should be free to live it however you want. If you don't want to talk about this, then we won't talk about it. Don't worry. I'm still here. I'll take care of you. You have nothing to worry about." George looked up at Anna, his expression perplexed. Clara could see he wanted to say something. He seemed frustrated by how she was speaking. "You're right," he admitted. "I shouldn't get angry with you. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me, though. What did you mean when you said you were only trying to help me? Is that all I need to hear? That you'll keep taking care of me? Am I supposed to trust that?" Anna sighed. "Of course not," she answered. "If I told you everything there is to know about me, then how would we ever be able to start a relationship together? How would you feel about that? Wouldn't you feel like you were trapped?" He shook his head. "You're not making any sense," he insisted. "That's exactly why I can't trust you. You're not being honest. All of these things you're saying, you're making them sound so simple. But if they were really as easy as you think, then everyone would be happy. And that doesn't happen very often. I've seen people who are unhappy most of the time. Even those who seem to be having fun aren't truly enjoying themselves. So maybe you're wrong about everything. Maybe I am," she conceded. "But it's true that some people are happier than others. And if I'm wrong about that, then what else might I be wrong about? Maybe you'd rather stay in bed every morning instead of getting up and going to work. Maybe you'd rather eat fast food every day because that's more convenient than cooking dinner. Maybe you'd prefer to spend hours watching television instead of reading books. Or maybe you'd rather spend your entire life working on a hobby or playing video games instead of studying for an exam. Who knows what kinds of things you'd choose to do? You're not even listening to what I'm saying. Your mind isn't open to new possibilities. You're afraid of change, and you refuse to accept reality. You don't want to grow as a person, and you're determined to remain the same forever. That's why you're lonely. That's why you don't have friends." "What are you talking about?" George asked. Clara saw the look of confusion on his face. She thought she understood what was happening. He was feeling overwhelmed by her words. "Look, George," she said gently. "We're both adults here. Let's leave our egos out of this. I understand where you're coming from, and I agree with you. There's no reason for us to act like children. But I also know that there are a lot of different ways to live your life. I've been living mine for over 50 years now. I know there's nothing better than waking up every morning knowing that someone cares about you. Someone will wait for you to come home after work, and they'll give you a hug. When you go shopping for groceries, you won't have to worry about buying too much or not enough. And when you fall asleep at night, you won't have to wonder if anyone loves you. No one has to love you. You can love yourself. But if you're alone, then you never find out whether you really deserve that kind of happiness. Her voice trailed off. There are lots of good reasons for finding a partner, she continued. And if you're willing to put in the effort to make things work, then you can enjoy a wonderful relationship. You can have a family, and you can raise kids who turn into good people. You can build memories, and you can laugh together. But it takes hard work. It requires compromise. Sometimes, you have to let go of old dreams and hopes. Sometimes, you have to learn how to forgive. You have to try to understand another person. And sometimes, you have to accept that you may never get what you want. I'm not telling you this to scare you away. I'm just trying to explain the realities of the situation. She paused again before continuing. All I can ask is that you please listen carefully. Think about my words. I know that they might hurt, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that you understand me. I'm not trying to force you into anything. I'm simply asking you to consider my feelings. Do you promise not to get upset with me? Can you promise that you won't call me names? Will you keep an open mind? George stared down at the table, frowning. His eyes looked glazed, as though he had lost all interest in what Clara was saying. I promise, he muttered quietly. I promise. I promise. The waitress came back to take their order. She smiled as she walked toward them. She placed a menu on the table, and she waited patiently for them to place their orders. I'll have a hamburger and fries, George said. And that was a story about three strangers named Clara, George, and Anna who had been forced together by a tragic situation.